In my 20 years investigating crimes, I'd never encountered evil hiding behind such an innocent face. Jennifer Walsh was a trusted babysitter, caring for 6-year-old Isaac while his mother worked double shifts. But when Isaac disappeared that August morning, something felt wrong. The house was too clean, her story kept changing, and then we found him, stuffed inside the oven in a duffel bag. She'd lured him with promises of making cookies for his mom, then beat him with concrete wrapped in a sock. But what haunts me most isn't how she killed him, it's why she smiled when she heard his mother's screams of anguish. Subscribe to this channel because cases like Isaac's reveal how monsters can hide behind the faces of people we trust most with our children. August 25, 2017, Admiral Thompson, Pennsylvania. 6-year-old Isaac Franklin was just another kid who needed someone to watch him while his mother worked her double shifts at the diner downtown. Just another ordinary Friday morning in a small industrial town where everyone knew everyone, and trust was something you handed out like spare change to neighbors. But Isaac Franklin would never make it home that day. When Detective Thomas Rivera first got the call about a missing child, he thought it would be routine. Maybe the kid wandered off to the playground. Maybe he was hiding in a closet, playing games. Maybe this was just another false alarm in a career filled with them. Rivera had been working cases for over 15 years, and he'd seen enough missing children reports to know that most of them ended with relief, not tragedy. He was wrong. Dead wrong. Rivera had been pulling an all-nighter, working on a homicide case that had been eating at him for weeks. The paperwork was spread across his desk, like a puzzle he couldn't solve, and his coffee had gone cold hours ago. His partner had already gone home, complaining about working weekends, but Rivera stayed. He always stayed. There was something about unsolved cases that kept him awake at night, something that made him push harder when everyone else had given up. Admiral Thompson wasn't exactly a hotbed of criminal activity, but it wasn't paradise either. Situated in the Rust Belt of Pennsylvania, it was one of those forgotten industrial towns where the factories had closed decades ago, leaving behind empty buildings and broken dreams. The kind of place where people worked multiple jobs just to keep the lights on, where single mothers like Isaac's mom had to trust their children to whoever was available and affordable. Rivera was no stranger to this world. He'd grown up 3 towns over, in a place just like Admiral Thompson. He knew what it felt like to be a latchkey kid, to spend afternoons with babysitters who were barely older than teenagers themselves. He understood the desperation that drove parents to leave their children with people they barely knew, simply because they had no other choice. The call came in at exactly 10:17 a.m. Rivera remembered the time because he'd been staring at the clock, calculating how many hours he'd been awake. 42 hours straight. His eyes were burning, his hands were shaking from too much caffeine, and all he wanted was to finish the temporary arrest warrant he'd been working on and go home to see his own 4-year-old son. Detective Martinez burst through the door, his face flushed with the kind of urgency that makes every cop's blood run cold. "We've got a missing child," he said, his voice tight with tension. 6 years old, been gone since last night. Rivera felt that familiar pit in his stomach, the one that opened up whenever children were involved. Missing children cases were different. The clock didn't just tick, it screamed. Every minute that passed was another minute that child could be in danger. Another minute that hope slipped away like sand through desperate fingers. "Details," Rivera demanded, already reaching for his jacket. "Isaac Franklin, 6 years old. Last seen with his babysitter yesterday evening. Mother works nights at Murphy's Diner. Comes home this morning, kid's gone. Babysitter says she put him to bed around 8. Checked on him around 10, then found his bed empty this morning." Rivera's instincts were already firing warning signals. Something about the timeline felt wrong, felt rehearsed. In his experience, when babysitters had perfectly organized stories about bedtime routines and check-ins, it usually meant they'd had time to think about what they were going to say. Too much time. The babysitter still at the house? Waiting for us. Name's Jennifer Walsh, 22 years old, been watching Isaac for about 3 months. No criminal record, clean background check. Neighbors say she seemed nice enough. Nice enough. Rivera had learned not to trust nice enough years ago. Some of the most dangerous people he'd ever arrested had been described as nice enough by their neighbors. It was amazing how well evil could hide behind a friendly smile and a clean record. They drove through the winding streets of Admiral Thompson, past the abandoned steel mill that had once been the town's heartbeat. past the rows of small houses with sagging porches and broken dreams. The August heat was already oppressive at 10 in the morning, the kind of sticky humidity that made everything feel thick and wrong. Rivera found himself thinking about his own son, safe at home with his wife, 4 years old, just 2 years younger than Isaac. The thought made his chest tight with a protective fury he'd learned to channel into determination. Every missing child case felt personal, but this one already had hooks in him deeper than usual. As they pulled up to the modest 2-story house on Elm Street, Rivera noticed details that would later prove crucial. The yard was neat, but not obsessive. Children's toys scattered on the front porch, a bicycle with training wheels, a soccer ball, a stuffed animal that looked like it had been dropped in a hurry. Normal things, innocent things. But Rivera had learned long ago that normal and innocent were often just masks that hid the unspeakable. The house itself was unremarkable. White siding, blue shutters, a small garden that someone had tried to maintain but was losing the battle against weeds. It was the kind of house where working families lived, where people did their best with what they had. The kind of house where a single mother would trust a young woman to care for her most precious possession while she worked to keep food on the table. Before they even reached the front door, Rivera's trained eye was cataloging inconsistencies. The curtains in the front window were drawn tight, unusual for a morning when natural light would be welcome. A trash bag sat by the curb, even though it wasn't garbage day until Tuesday. Small things, details that might mean nothing or might mean everything. Detective Martinez rang the doorbell, and they waited. Rivera used those few seconds to study the house more carefully, his mind already working through possibilities. In missing children cases, statistics were cruel, but clear. Most children were harmed by someone they knew, someone their families trusted. Strangers snatching kids off the street made for scary headlines, but the real monsters usually wore familiar faces. The door opened, and Rivera got his first look at Jennifer Walsh. She was young, probably younger than her 22 years, with the kind of fresh-faced appearance that would make any parent feel comfortable leaving their child in her care. Brown hair pulled back in a ponytail, minimal makeup, wearing jeans and a t-shirt that suggested she'd been up early, worried about Isaac. Her eyes were red-rimmed, either from crying or from a sleepless night, or from something else entirely. "Officers, thank God you're here," she said, her voice trembling with what sounded like genuine distress. "I've been so worried about Isaac. I can't understand how this happened. I checked on him. I know I checked on him. And then this morning..." Rivera let her talk, watching her body language, listening to her tone. 20 years of police work had taught him to read people like books, and Jennifer Walsh was a book he intended to study very carefully. There was something in her eyes, something that didn't quite match the distress in her voice. A flicker of something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. "Ms. Walsh, we're going to need to search the house thoroughly," Rivera said, his voice calm but authoritative. "We'll also need you to walk us through exactly what happened yesterday evening, from the time Isaac's mother left until you discovered he was missing." "Of course, anything you need," Jennifer replied quickly, too quickly. As they stepped into the house, Rivera felt that familiar chill that came with crime scenes. The living room looked normal enough, furniture slightly worn but clean, children's books stacked on a coffee table, a few toys scattered around. But there was something in the air, something that made Rivera's instincts scream warnings he couldn't yet articulate. He'd been doing this job long enough to know that houses held secrets, and some secrets were darker than others. As he looked around Isaac Franklin's temporary home, Rivera had no idea that he was about to uncover one of the most disturbing cases of his career. But even with all his experience, all his training, all his instincts honed by years of investigating the worst of humanity, Detective Thomas Rivera wasn't prepared for what they would find in the kitchen, because some horrors are so unthinkable that even seasoned investigators can't imagine them until they're staring evil directly in the face, wondering how they missed the signs that were there all along. Rivera had learned long ago that in criminal investigations, there were no coincidences. Every detail mattered. Every inconsistency was a breadcrumb leading somewhere darker. And as he stood in Jennifer Walsh's kitchen that Friday morning, those breadcrumbs were forming a trail that made his stomach turn. The story Jennifer had told him was falling apart under scrutiny. She claimed Isaac had disappeared sometime during the night, that she'd checked on him at 10 p.m. and found him gone. But Rivera's trained eye was seeing something else entirely. The house told a different story, one written in scrubbed floors and suspicious timing. What bothered Rivera most was Jennifer's behavior. He'd interviewed hundreds of people in crisis situations, and genuine panic had a particular quality to it. Real fear was messy, chaotic, inconsistent, but Jennifer Walsh was too composed, too ready with explanations, too quick to fill in details before he asked for them. She was performing grief rather than feeling it. "Tell me about Isaac's routine," Rivera said, settling back into his interrogation mode. Was he the type of child who would get up in the middle of the night? Did he sleepwalk? Was he afraid of the dark? Jennifer's eyes darted to David, who had remained silent throughout the questioning. That glance lasted less than a second, but Rivera caught it. In his experience, when suspects looked to their partners before answering simple questions, it usually meant they were checking to make sure their stories aligned. "Isaac was a good sleeper," Jennifer said carefully. "He never had problems with nightmares or anything like that. But lately, he'd been talking about wanting to go home more often. Maybe he just got homesick and decided to try to walk back to his mother's house." The explanation sounded reasonable enough, but Rivera had been working cases long enough to know that the most dangerous lies were the ones wrapped in just enough truth to seem plausible. A 6-year-old getting homesick was believable. A 6-year-old climbing out a window and walking across town in the middle of the night was possible, if unlikely. But a 6-year-old doing all of that without leaving any trace, any footprints, any sign of struggle or escape. That was where Jennifer's story stopped being possible and started being impossible. Rivera excused himself and stepped outside to coordinate with his team. The search was expanding beyond the immediate neighborhood now. Officers were checking the bus station, interviewing taxi drivers, following up on any sightings of a small boy matching Isaac's description. The community response had been overwhelming. Volunteers were organizing search parties, local businesses were posting Isaac's picture, and the mayor had promised full municipal support. But even as the town of Admiral Thompson mobilized to find Isaac Franklin, Rivera was becoming more convinced that the little boy they were searching for was never going to be found alive. Detective Martinez approached with an update that confirmed Rivera's worst fears. "We've canvassed every house within a 6-block radius," he reported quietly. "Nobody saw Isaac last night, nobody heard anything unusual. And that bakery Jennifer mentioned, the owner says no kids came in yesterday, and definitely not after closing time at 6 p.m. Rivera felt that familiar cold certainty settling in his chest. Jennifer Walsh was lying. The question was why, and more importantly, what had she done with Isaac Franklin? "There's something else," Martinez continued, his voice even lower. "I talked to some of the neighbors about Jennifer and David. Apparently there's been tension in that house lately. Arguments, loud voices late at night. One neighbor said she heard what sounded like a child crying around 10 p.m. last night, but then it stopped suddenly. The pieces were clicking into place now, forming a picture that Rivera wished he couldn't see so clearly. A child crying at 10 p.m., exactly when Jennifer claimed she'd checked on Isaac and found him sleeping peacefully. Arguments and tension in the house. A babysitter with a too-perfect story, and a boyfriend who hadn't said a word all morning. Rivera had worked enough child abuse cases to recognize the pattern. Sometimes babysitters snapped. Sometimes the stress of caring for multiple children, the financial pressure, the demands of maintaining a household became too much. Sometimes frustrated adults took out their anger on the most vulnerable targets available, but even in his darkest suspicions, Rivera wasn't prepared for what they would discover next. "I want to search this house thoroughly," he told Martinez. "Get a warrant if we need one, but I want every room, every closet, every hiding place examined, and I want Jennifer and David separated for questioning. No more joint interviews." As Rivera prepared to dig deeper into the investigation, he couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Not for Isaac. Rivera was increasingly certain that Isaac's time had already run out, but for the chance to find evidence before it was destroyed or disposed of. The problem with crime scenes was that they degraded over time. Physical evidence disappeared, memories became unreliable, and guilty parties had more opportunities to cover their tracks. Rivera had arrived at the house 3 hours after Isaac's disappearance was reported, which meant he was already working at a disadvantage. But criminals, especially amateur criminals committing crimes of passion, made mistakes. They overlooked details, left evidence behind, told lies that could be unraveled with careful investigation. And Rivera had spent 20 years learning how to find those mistakes. The first break came when Rivera decided to search the basement. Jennifer had mentioned it casually when giving them the tour of the house, dismissing it as just storage space that Isaac would never have any reason to go down to. But Rivera had learned to pay special attention to the places suspects were eager to dismiss. The basement was accessed through a door off the kitchen, with wooden steps leading down into a space that was indeed used primarily for storage. Boxes of old clothes, holiday decorations, broken furniture waiting to be repaired or thrown away. Nothing immediately suspicious, nothing that screamed crime scene. But Rivera's nose picked up something that made him pause. That same faint odor he'd detected in the kitchen, but stronger down here. Metallic, organic, wrong. He'd smelled it before in other basements, other crime scenes, other places where violence had occurred, and someone had tried unsuccessfully to clean up the aftermath. "Martinez," he called up the stairs, "I need you down here, and bring the crime scene kit." As his partner descended into the basement, Rivera was already examining the concrete floor more carefully. Most of it was covered with a thin layer of dust and debris that suggested normal, infrequent use. But near the far wall there was an area that looked different, cleaner, as if someone had scrubbed it recently, trying to remove something that shouldn't have been there. "You smell that?" Rivera asked. Martinez nodded grimly. "Yeah, I smell it." They worked methodically, documenting everything, photographing the space, collecting samples of what looked like might be trace evidence. Rivera had a feeling they were getting close to answers, even though part of him dreaded what those answers might be. It was Martinez who found the first piece of concrete evidence. Hidden behind a stack of boxes, wedged between the wall and an old water heater, was a child's shoe. Small, worn, exactly the type a 6-year-old boy would wear. Rivera held the shoe in his gloved hands and felt the weight of certainty settle over him like a shroud. This wasn't a missing child case anymore. This was a homicide investigation, and somewhere in this house, or somewhere Jennifer Walsh had access to, was the body of Isaac Franklin. The only question now was whether Rivera could prove it before the people responsible had a chance to destroy the rest of the evidence, because he was learning that Jennifer Walsh was more cunning than her innocent appearance suggested. And if she had killed Isaac Franklin, she had also been planning how to get away with it. The clock was ticking, and Rivera was about to discover just how far someone would go to cover up the unthinkable. The tension between Isaac's mother and Jennifer Walsh was palpable, crackling like electricity in the humid August air. Rivera could feel it the moment he walked into the living room where both women sat, their body language screaming hostility, despite their attempts to appear cooperative. Mrs. Rebecca Franklin, Isaac's mother, was a woman worn down by life's relentless demands. At 34, she looked older, her hands rough from years of collecting scrap metal and recyclables to make ends meet. Her eyes held the desperate fury of a mother whose child had vanished, but there was something else there too, suspicion, anger, the kind of rage that comes from betrayal by someone you trusted. Jennifer Walsh sat across from her, playing her role as the concerned babysitter, but Rivera noticed how her eyes kept darting to David Carter, her boyfriend, who lurked near the kitchen doorway like a guard dog. Every time Rivera asked Jennifer a question, she would glance at David before answering, as if seeking permission or confirmation. "Tell me about last night," Rivera said to both women. "Was there any conflict between you two? Any disagreements about Isaac's care?" The question hit like a match thrown into gasoline. Rebecca's composure cracked instantly. "You want to know about conflict?" Rebecca's voice rose, months of suppressed anger finally breaking free. "This woman has been stealing from me for months, taking money that was meant for my son, living off benefits that should have been helping Isaac, and charging me to watch my own child while she was already getting paid with my money." Jennifer's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Rivera felt that familiar investigative instinct kick into high gear, financial motive. In his experience, money was often the root of violence, especially in communities where every dollar mattered. "Tell me about these benefits," he said to Rebecca. The story that emerged was more complex and more sinister than Rivera had initially suspected. Isaac had been born with a mild foot deformity that required special orthopedic boots, making him eligible for disability benefits. Combined with other assistance programs, the monthly payments were substantial enough to make a real difference in a struggling family's budget. Jennifer Walsh had befriended Rebecca months earlier, offering to help navigate the bureaucratic maze of government assistance programs. She claimed to know a lawyer who could expedite the process, make sure Rebecca got everything she was entitled to. All she needed was Rebecca's documentation, her social security information, her trust. What Rebecca didn't know was that Jennifer had redirected those benefits to herself, using Rebecca's identity to establish accounts in her own name. For months, Jennifer had been collecting money intended for Isaac's care, while simultaneously charging Rebecca for babysitting services. It was a perfect scam. The victim was illiterate, desperate, and grateful for any help. But perfect scams have a way of unraveling, and Jennifer's had started to collapse the night before Isaac disappeared. "My daughter Sarah figured it out," Rebecca explained, her voice shaking with remembered fury. "She went to check on the benefit payments because we hadn't received anything in weeks. That's when we discovered what Jennifer had been doing. The confrontation had been explosive. Sarah Franklin, Rebecca's 19-year-old daughter, had marched over to Jennifer's house Thursday evening, demanding answers and immediate repayment. According to Rebecca, the argument had been loud enough for neighbors to hear, full of accusations and threats. Sarah told her to pay back every penny or we'd call the police, Rebecca continued. Jennifer kept making excuses, saying there had been mix-ups, promising to fix everything. But Sarah wasn't having it. She gave Jennifer until Friday to return the money. Friday, the day Isaac disappeared. Rivera felt the pieces clicking into place like tumblers in a lock. Jennifer Walsh hadn't just been caring for Isaac Franklin. She'd been systematically defrauding his family, stealing money meant for a disabled child's care. When she was caught, when the walls started closing in, when faced with criminal charges and financial ruin, she had decided to silence the one person whose disability benefits she'd been stealing. But the financial motive was only part of the story. As Rivera dug deeper into David Carter's background, he discovered something that made his blood run cold. David Carter had a criminal history that Jennifer had neglected to mention. In 2009, he'd been charged with sexual abuse of a minor, his own daughter from a previous relationship. The case had been dropped due to lack of evidence and witness recantation, but Rivera knew how often such cases fell apart due to intimidation or family pressure rather than innocence. Suddenly, Rivera was looking at a much darker possibility. What if Isaac hadn't just been killed to cover up financial fraud? What if the 6-year-old boy had been subjected to something even more horrific before his death? David Carter's behavior was raising red flags everywhere Rivera looked. The man was nervous, evasive, unable to maintain eye contact. More telling, he seemed to be monitoring Jennifer's every word, positioning himself where he could watch her interactions with police. It was classic controlling behavior, the kind Rivera had seen in domestic abuse cases, where one partner kept the other in line through intimidation. "I need to speak with David privately," Rivera told Jennifer, watching her reaction carefully. The flash of panic in her eyes was unmistakable. "Why? He doesn't know anything about Isaac. He was asleep when it happened. Then he won't mind answering a few simple questions." Rivera separated the couple, taking David to the kitchen while Martinez continued questioning Jennifer in the living room. It was a standard technique. Split up potential accomplices, prevent them from coordinating their stories, see where the contradictions emerged. David Carter was sweating despite the morning air conditioning, his hands trembling as he chain-smoked cigarettes. When Rivera asked him about his whereabouts the previous evening, David's story kept changing. First he'd been asleep all night. Then he'd been up watching television. Then he'd gone for a walk around midnight but couldn't remember where. "Tell me about Isaac," Rivera said. "What kind of kid was he? Did you interact with him much?" "Not really," David mumbled, not meeting Rivera's eyes. "Jennifer handled all that kid stuff. I just minded my own business." But neighbors would later tell a different story. They'd seen David playing with Isaac in the yard, teaching him to throw a football, seemingly enjoying the boy's company. So why was he now claiming minimal contact? Rivera pressed harder. "Some people might think it's strange, a 6-year-old boy disappearing from a house where a man with your history is living." David's head snapped up, fear and anger warring in his expression. "That was years ago. Those charges were dropped. I never did anything to that girl. But you understand why it raises questions about Isaac. I don't know what happened to that kid," David said, his voice rising. "You're barking up the wrong tree here." The more Rivera talked to David Carter, the more convinced he became that both he and Jennifer were lying about something fundamental. Their stories didn't align, their explanations kept shifting, and both of them seemed far more concerned about protecting themselves than finding Isaac. But Rivera needed more than suspicions and inconsistencies. He needed physical evidence, and he had a growing certainty about where to find it. The house on Elm Street was hiding secrets, and Rivera was determined to uncover them all. Because somewhere in that aqua-green wooden structure, or somewhere Jennifer Walsh and David Carter had access to, was the truth about what had really happened to Isaac Franklin. And Rivera was beginning to suspect that the truth was more horrific than anyone in the community of Admiral Thompson could possibly imagine. The financial fraud was just the beginning. The sexual abuse allegations were another piece of the puzzle. But the complete picture, what had actually been done to a 6-year-old boy in the hours before his disappearance, was something that would haunt Rivera for the rest of his career. The clock was ticking, evidence was being destroyed or hidden, and Rivera knew he was running out of time to find Isaac Franklin before the people responsible covered their tracks completely. What he didn't know was that the worst discovery was still waiting for him, hidden in the last place anyone would think to look. The interrogation room at the Admiral Thompson Police Department felt smaller than usual that Friday afternoon. Rivera had questioned hundreds of suspects in that same cramped space, but something about this case made the walls seem to press in closer. The fluorescent lights burn harsher. The silence between questions stretched longer and more ominous. Jennifer Walsh sat across from him, no longer the composed young woman who had greeted him at her front door that morning. The mask was slipping, revealing glimpses of something desperate and calculating underneath. Her hands trembled as she reached for the paper cup of water Rivera had provided, and her eyes kept darting to the door as if she was planning an escape route. "Jennifer," Rivera said, his voice deliberately calm and reassuring, "I need you to help me understand something. You mentioned earlier that someone called you this morning, said they'd seen Isaac in the neighborhood, but when I asked to see your phone, you seemed reluctant. I told you, I already paid my bill. The call history gets deleted when you pay." Rivera had been a detective long enough to know when someone was lying about technology they didn't fully understand. Phone companies didn't automatically delete call logs when bills were paid. But more importantly, Jennifer's story about the mysterious phone call had already changed 3 times since that morning. "Let me see your phone anyway," Rivera said. "Even if the call log is gone, we might be able to get the information from your carrier." The panic that flashed across Jennifer's face was unmistakable. Why do you need to see it? I'm telling you the truth." "Because, Jennifer, nothing about your story is adding up. And until we find Isaac, everyone who was with him yesterday is going to be scrutinized very carefully." Rivera leaned forward slightly, employing the interrogation technique that had served him well for 20 years. He spoke quietly, almost conspiratorially, making Jennifer feel like he was on her side even as he closed the investigative net around her. "Listen, I understand you're scared. I understand you might have made some mistakes, maybe didn't watch Isaac as carefully as you should have, but right now we're not talking about negligence. We're talking about a missing child, and the longer Isaac is gone, the more serious this becomes for everyone involved." Jennifer's composure was cracking visibly now. Her breathing became more rapid, her hands more restless. Rivera could see her mind working, weighing options, calculating risks. In his experience, this was the moment when suspects either broke down and confessed, or doubled down on their lies and demanded a lawyer. "I've been completely honest with you," Jennifer said, but her voice lacked conviction. "I checked on Isaac at 10 p.m. and he was fine. I don't know what happened after that." "What about David? Where was he during all this?" "He was sleeping. He works construction, so he goes to bed early." But Rivera had already interviewed David separately, and his story was completely different. David claimed he'd been up late watching television, that he'd seen Jennifer checking on Isaac multiple times throughout the evening, that he'd heard the boy crying around midnight, but assumed Jennifer was handling it. The inconsistencies were piling up like snow in a blizzard, and Rivera was about to dig deeper when his phone buzzed with a text message from Detective Martinez. The message was brief, but chilling. "Found something at the house. Come back now." Rivera excused himself, leaving Jennifer in the interrogation room with a uniformed officer. As he drove back to Elm Street, his mind was racing through possibilities. What had Martinez found? Physical evidence? Isaac's body? Something that would finally crack this case wide open. The scene at Jennifer's house had transformed in his absence. What had been a routine missing person investigation that morning was now clearly a crime scene. Police tape cordoned off the property, evidence technicians were photographing everything, and neighbors had gathered in small clusters, whispering among themselves with the mixture of fascination and horror that violent crime brought to small communities. Martinez met him at the front door, his face grim. "It's bad, Tom, really bad. Show me." They walked through the house to the kitchen, where Rivera's attention was immediately drawn to the stove. The oven door was open, and crime scene photographers were documenting everything with methodical precision. "We decided to search more thoroughly after you left," Martinez explained. "Started looking in places we hadn't checked earlier. When we opened the oven," Rivera's blood turned to ice as he peered inside. There, crammed into the small space, was a child-sized duffel bag. Even without opening it, Rivera knew with horrible certainty what they had found. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. "It gets worse," Martinez continued. "The medical examiner is on her way, but preliminary examination suggests the victim suffered significant trauma before death. We're looking at torture, sexual assault, and ultimately murder." Rivera felt that familiar cold rage that came with cases involving children. In his 20 years of police work, he'd seen humanity at its absolute worst, but something about crimes against children always hit him differently. Maybe it was because he had a young son of his own. Maybe it was because children represented innocence in a world that seemed increasingly devoid of it. Jennifer and David? Still in custody. David's lawyer showed up about an hour ago, so he's not talking anymore. But Jennifer, she's starting to crack. She's been asking to speak with you specifically. Rivera took a moment to process what they'd discovered. Isaac Franklin hadn't wandered off in the night. He hadn't been kidnapped by strangers. He'd been murdered in the house where he was supposed to be safe, by people his mother had trusted to care for him. The financial fraud had been just the beginning. When confronted about stealing Isaac's disability benefits, when faced with criminal charges and exposure, Jennifer Walsh and David Carter had decided that the 6-year-old boy who could testify against them was a problem that needed to be eliminated. But even as Rivera tried to understand the logistics of the crime, the timeline, the motive, his mind kept returning to one horrifying detail: the oven. They had stuffed Isaac's body into the oven. The symbolism was almost too twisted to comprehend. An oven was meant to provide nourishment, to cook food that sustained life. To use it as a hiding place for a murdered child was a perversion so profound that it seemed to violate something fundamental about human nature. Rivera had to steel himself before returning to the interrogation room. He'd been doing this job long enough to know that getting emotional wouldn't help Isaac now. The boy was dead, and the only justice Rivera could provide was making sure his killers faced the full consequences of their actions. Jennifer Walsh looked up hopefully when Rivera entered the room, as if she thought he might be bringing good news. Her expression changed quickly when she saw his face. "We found him, Jennifer." The words hit her like a physical blow. All pretense, all deception, all carefully constructed lies evaporated in an instant. Jennifer Walsh collapsed forward, her face in her hands, her body shaking with sobs that sounded more like the cries of a wounded animal than expressions of human grief. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she whispered through her tears. "It was an accident. Everything just went so wrong." Rivera sat down across from her, his voice deadly calm. "Tell me what really happened to Isaac Franklin." And finally, after hours of lies and misdirection, after a day of searching for a boy who had been dead since the night before, Jennifer Walsh began to tell the truth about the last hours of Isaac Franklin's short life. What Rivera heard in that interrogation room would haunt him for the rest of his career. Because sometimes the reality of human evil is worse than anything the imagination can conjure. And sometimes the truth about what people can do to children is more horrifying than any nightmare. The confession was just beginning, but Rivera already knew that this case would forever change how he saw the world, how he understood the capacity for cruelty that lurked behind even the most innocent facades. Isaac Franklin had trusted Jennifer Walsh to keep him safe. Instead, she had become the architect of his destruction. The ride back to Jennifer's house was the longest 10 minutes of Rivera's career. Sitting beside him in the passenger seat, Jennifer Walsh was falling apart in real time, her carefully constructed lies crumbling like a house of cards in a hurricane. But it wasn't remorse that was breaking her down. It was the terrible realization that she'd been caught. "I was being threatened," Jennifer whispered, her voice barely audible over the engine noise. Rebecca was demanding money, making accusations. She was trying to destroy my life over some paperwork mix-ups. Rivera kept his expression neutral, his voice calm, even as rage burned in his chest. In his 20 years of police work, he'd learned to compartmentalize his emotions, to maintain professional detachment even when confronting humanity's darkest impulses. But this case was testing those skills to their absolute limit. "Tell me what happened, Jennifer. Tell me about Isaac." Her breathing became more rapid, more shallow. Rivera could see her struggling with the decision to confess, weighing her options, calculating whether the truth might somehow save her. It was a calculation he'd seen thousands of times before, and it always came down to the same thing. Criminals weren't sorry for what they'd done. They were sorry they'd been caught. "I wanted to hurt Rebecca," Jennifer said finally, her voice taking on a strange, detached quality. "I wanted her to feel the kind of pain she was causing me. I wanted her to know what it felt like to lose something precious." The words hit Rivera like physical blows. This wasn't a crime of passion, a moment of anger that had spiraled out of control. This was calculated revenge, planned cruelty, the deliberate destruction of an innocent child to cause maximum suffering to his mother. "So you took Isaac?" "I told him we were going to surprise his mother. I said we'd make her favorite cookies and hide them in the oven until she came home." Jennifer's voice was eerily calm now, as if she was recounting a grocery shopping trip rather than describing the prelude to murder. He was so excited. He wanted to help mix the batter. Rivera's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Isaac Franklin had gone to his death thinking he was planning a surprise for his mother. The innocence of that image, contrasted with what Rivera knew was coming, made his stomach lurch. As they pulled up to the house on Elm Street, Rivera could see that the crime scene had been secured. Police tape fluttered in the August breeze, and uniformed officers were keeping curious neighbors at bay. But Rivera's attention was focused entirely on the woman beside him, the woman who was about to show him exactly where she'd hidden Isaac Franklin's body. They entered through the front door, Jennifer moving with the mechanical precision of someone in shock. She led Rivera directly to the kitchen, to the small oven that had seemed so innocuous that morning when he'd first searched the house. "I didn't know what else to do with him," Jennifer said, her voice completely devoid of emotion. "I panicked. I thought if I could hide him long enough, maybe I could figure out how to make it look like an accident." Rivera watched in horrified fascination as Jennifer opened the oven door with steady hands. Inside was a small duffel bag, zipped closed, containing what remained of Isaac Franklin. The bag was much too small for a 6-year-old boy, which meant she'd had to fold his tiny body, compress it, force it into a space never meant to hold human remains. The logistics of the crime were as disturbing as the crime itself. Removing the oven racks to make space, finding a bag that would fit, cleaning up the evidence of what she'd done, all while her own children slept in the next room, while David Carter pretended not to know what was happening, while Rebecca Franklin worked her night shift at the diner, unaware that her son was already dead. "How did you kill him, Jennifer?" For the first time since they'd entered the house, Jennifer's composure cracked slightly. Her hands began to shake, and Rivera could see her struggling with whether to continue the confession. But they were past the point of no return now. The body had been found, the evidence was overwhelming, and silence would only make things worse for her in court. "There was a piece of concrete in the backyard," she said quietly. "Part of an old foundation that was broken up when they redid the patio. I hit him with it." Rivera felt the world tilt slightly. In all his years of investigating violent crime, he'd never encountered anything quite this cold, this calculated, this deliberately cruel. Jennifer Walsh had lured a 6-year-old boy to her house with promises of making cookies for his mother, then murdered him with a chunk of concrete to get revenge on a woman who had dared to demand her stolen money back. "Where's David in all this?" "He tried to stop me at first," Jennifer admitted, "but then he realized we were in too deep. He helped me clean up afterward." The confession was interrupted by the arrival of Rebecca Franklin. Rivera could hear her voice outside, demanding answers, demanding to know what had happened to her son. The anguish in her cries was a stark contrast to Jennifer's clinical recitation of the facts, and Rivera realized he was witnessing the exact outcome Jennifer had been hoping for, a mother's heart breaking in real time. But as Rivera listened to Rebecca's grief-stricken wails, he noticed something that chilled him to the bone. Jennifer Walsh was smiling, just slightly. just at the corners of her mouth, but unmistakably smiling as she listened to the sounds of a mother discovering her child was dead. "You're enjoying this," Rivera said, his professional detachment finally cracking. "You're actually enjoying her pain." Jennifer's smile disappeared, replaced by a look of surprise as if she hadn't realized her expression was visible. She needed to understand what she put me through. Rivera had to step outside for a moment, ostensibly to coordinate with the crime scene team, but really to compose himself before he did something that would compromise the investigation. In his entire career, he'd never encountered someone so completely devoid of human empathy, so capable of inflicting suffering without any apparent conscience. When he returned to the kitchen, Jennifer was staring at the open oven with an expression he couldn't quite read. Regret? Satisfaction? Something else entirely? "The part I don't understand," Rivera said carefully, "is how you thought you'd get away with this. You had to know we'd search the house eventually." "I thought maybe I could move him later," Jennifer replied, "or make it look like he'd been taken somewhere else. I just needed time to think. Time to think." As if the murder of a 6-year-old child was just a logistics problem to be solved, a puzzle to be worked out. Rivera realized he was dealing with someone whose capacity for evil was limited only by her imagination and opportunity. The crime scene team arrived and began the grim process of documenting everything, photographing the oven and its contents, collecting evidence that would later be used to convict Jennifer Walsh and David Carter of one of the most heinous crimes in Admiral Thompson's history. But even as Rivera watched the professionals do their work, even as he began the long process of building a case that would ensure justice for Isaac Franklin, he couldn't shake the image of Jennifer's smile, because in that moment, he'd seen something that would haunt him for the rest of his career. The face of evil wearing the mask of a neighbor, a babysitter, a young woman who should have been protecting children instead of destroying them. Isaac Franklin had died not because of some random act of violence, not because of some uncontrollable rage, but because someone had decided that a 6-year-old boy's life was worth sacrificing to cause pain to his mother. And in the end, that might have been the most terrifying revelation of all. The details of Isaac Franklin's final moments would haunt Detective Rivera for the rest of his career. As Jennifer Walsh's confession unfolded in that sterile interrogation room, Rivera found himself confronting a level of calculated cruelty that challenged everything he thought he knew about human nature. "I put the concrete chunk inside a sock," Jennifer said, with the same emotional detachment she might use to describe a recipe. "I thought it would muffle the sound. The children were sleeping in the next room, and I didn't want to wake them." Rivera felt his stomach lurch. Even in her confession, Jennifer was revealing the methodical planning that had gone into Isaac's murder. She hadn't acted in a moment of rage. She had prepared, calculated, taken steps to ensure her own children wouldn't be disturbed while she beat a 6-year-old boy to death in the next room. "I hit him repeatedly in the head," Jennifer continued, her voice never wavering. "He tried to cry out, but I kept hitting him. I needed him to stop making noise." But the most chilling revelation was yet to come. According to Jennifer's confession, Isaac hadn't died from the blunt force trauma to his head. The little boy had survived the initial assault, lying on the kitchen floor with what were likely fatal injuries, making small sounds of pain and distress. "He was still making little noises," Jennifer said, as if describing an annoying household pest. "Whimpering. I was afraid someone would hear." That's when Rivera learned about the electrical cord and the detail that would ultimately expose David Carter's involvement in the murder. Wrapped around Isaac's neck was a cord from a broken floor polisher, tied with what Rivera immediately recognized as a trucker's knot, a specialized knot that most people, especially women, would never know how to tie. It was a knot designed to create maximum pressure with a single line, effectively turning any rope or cord into a noose. Rivera had tried to tie that particular knot himself on several occasions and had never mastered it. It required specific knowledge, muscle memory, the kind of skill that came from years of practice, the kind of skill a truck driver would have. David Carter had been a truck driver. In her initial confession, Jennifer had insisted that David wasn't involved, that he'd been asleep throughout the entire ordeal, but the evidence of that knot told a different story. Either Jennifer Walsh had somehow acquired the specialized knowledge to tie a trucker's knot, or David Carter had participated in Isaac Franklin's murder. Rivera confronted Jennifer with this inconsistency in a second interrogation, watching her carefully as he described the specific characteristics of the knot found around Isaac's neck. For the first time since her confession began, Jennifer's composure cracked completely. I don't know how to tie knots like that," she admitted, her hands trembling. David was there when Isaac was still making noise. He said we had to finish it, that someone would hear and call the police. The truth that emerged was even more horrifying than Rivera had imagined. According to Jennifer's revised confession, she had indeed beaten Isaac with the concrete-filled sock, inflicting what would have been fatal head injuries. But the little boy hadn't died immediately. He had lain on the kitchen floor, suffering from massive head trauma, possibly brain hemorrhaging, making small sounds of pain. David Carter, Jennifer claimed, had decided they couldn't wait for Isaac to die from his injuries. The risk of being discovered was too great. So he had taken the electrical cord from their broken floor polisher and wrapped it around the dying child's neck, using his trucker's knot to ensure that Isaac would stop breathing quickly and quietly. David said it was more humane, Jennifer said, apparently seeing no irony in the statement, that it would be faster than waiting for him to die from the head injuries. Rivera had to step out of the interrogation room again, ostensibly to coordinate with other officers, but really to compose himself. In 20 years of police work, he'd never encountered anything quite so coldly calculated. This wasn't a crime of passion that had spiraled out of control. This was a planned execution, carried out with methodical precision by two people who had decided that a 6-year-old boy's life was an acceptable sacrifice for their own convenience. The crime scene evidence supported Jennifer's revised confession. The blood spatter patterns in the kitchen indicated that Isaac had been beaten while lying on the floor. The positioning of the electrical cord around his neck was consistent with strangulation occurring after the head trauma. The medical examiner would later confirm that Isaac had died from asphyxiation, not from his head injuries, meaning he had been conscious when David Carter wrapped that cord around his neck. Rivera arrested David Carter on the spot, charging him with first-degree murder. But David was a different kind of suspect than Jennifer. Where she had eventually broken down and confessed, David was what police called a jailbird, someone with enough experience in the criminal justice system to know exactly how to protect himself. David demanded a lawyer immediately. He refused to answer questions. He maintained his innocence with the practiced ease of someone who had been through the system before. Most frustratingly for Rivera, David seemed to understand that Jennifer's confession alone might not be enough to convict him, especially if she later recanted her statement. And that's exactly what happened. By the time the case went to trial, Jennifer Walsh had changed her story again. She now claimed that she had acted alone, that David had been asleep throughout the entire incident, that she had somehow learned to tie the trucker's knot from watching television or reading about it online. Her revised testimony was obviously false. No one learns to tie a complex knot like that from passive observation, but it created just enough reasonable doubt for David's defense team to exploit. The trial became a nightmare of legal maneuvering and conflicting testimony. Jennifer's multiple confessions were used against each other, creating confusion about what had actually happened in those final moments of Isaac's life. David's defense team painted him as an innocent man, caught up in his girlfriend's psychotic break, a victim of circumstance who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Rivera watched in growing frustration as the jury struggled with the evidence. He knew that David Carter had participated in Isaac Franklin's murder. He had seen the knot with his own eyes, had documented its specific characteristics, had confirmed that Jennifer Walsh lacked the knowledge to tie such a knot herself. But the legal system required proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and Jennifer's changing testimony had introduced just enough doubt to save David's life. In the end, Jennifer Walsh was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 22 years in prison. David Carter was acquitted on all charges, walking out of the courthouse a free man, despite Rivera's absolute certainty that he had helped strangle a 6-year-old boy to death. The verdict was devastating for Isaac's family and infuriating for Rivera, but it represented something even more troubling about the nature of justice itself. Sometimes, the legal system's protections for the accused work in favor of the guilty. Sometimes technicalities and reasonable doubt allow evil to escape consequences. Sometimes the truth isn't enough to ensure justice, but the community of Admiral Thompson had its own sense of justice, and it was far less forgiving than the legal system. While Jennifer Walsh began serving her 22-year sentence, the house where Isaac had been murdered became a target for the town's rage. Windows were broken, walls were spray-painted with accusations and threats, and eventually the entire structure was burned to the ground by vigilantes who felt that the law hadn't gone far enough. David Carter, though legally innocent, found himself effectively exiled from the community. No one would hire him, no one would rent to him, no one would associate with him. He left Admiral Thompson within weeks of his acquittal, disappearing into the anonymity of America's vast highway system, presumably returning to the truck driving that had taught him how to tie the knot that had ended Isaac Franklin's life. Rivera knew that David Carter would never face legal consequences for his role in Isaac's murder, but he also knew that some forms of justice existed outside the courtroom, and that David would carry the weight of his actions for the rest of his life, whether he admitted his guilt or not. The case officially closed with Jennifer's conviction, but for Rivera, it would never really be over. Because somewhere out there, a man who had helped murder a child was driving America's highways, carrying his secret with him, free in body but trapped forever by the knowledge of what he had done to an innocent 6-year-old boy who had only wanted to make cookies for his mother. And in that truth, Rivera found the only justice he could accept, that evil might escape earthly punishment, but it could never escape the prison of its own conscience. Even if that conscience chose to remain forever silent, the aftermath of Isaac Franklin's murder would resonate through Admiral Thompson for years to come, but for Detective Rivera, the case represented something far more troubling than a single act of violence. It was a window into the darkest corners of human nature, a revelation about how easily ordinary people could cross lines that should never be crossed. David Carter had served only 1 year and 4 months in jail before his acquittal, a period that Rivera considered woefully inadequate for his role in a child's murder. But perhaps more disturbing was what the case revealed about the nature of justice itself, and how the legal system's protections could sometimes shield the guilty as effectively as they protected the innocent. The thing about certain crimes, Rivera would later reflect, is that when the state doesn't act decisively, people start to believe they can get away with anything. And sometimes they're right. Rivera had seen this pattern before in his career. Criminals who operated with impunity because they understood the weaknesses in the system, who calculated their risks based on the likelihood of meaningful consequences rather than the moral weight of their actions. David Carter had gotten that message loud and clear during his brief incarceration. The state existed. It could reach him, but it might not reach far enough to truly punish him. The detective often told his officers that the goal of any investigation wasn't just to solve the crime, but to send a message to the criminal, to the community, to other potential offenders. Even when they couldn't secure a conviction, even when the evidence wasn't quite strong enough, the investigation itself served a purpose. It demonstrated that law enforcement was watching, that actions had consequences, that no one was truly invisible. "I always tell my team," Rivera would say, "it doesn't matter if we get the conviction we want. What matters is that we do our job completely. If we can't get an arrest, we push for a temporary detention. If we can't get a detention, we execute search warrants. We make sure they understand that the police exist, that the law exists, that someone is always watching." This philosophy had been shaped by Rivera's conversations with criminals who had lived in other countries, particularly the United States. Time and again, he'd arrested people for drug trafficking or other serious crimes, only to learn that they had lived law-abiding lives when they were overseas. "I remember arresting this dealer," Rivera recalled, "and when I asked him if he'd sold drugs when he was living in the States, he looked at me like I was crazy. 'Hell no,' he said. 'You get caught with that stuff over there, they throw away the key.' I'm not stupid." But here he figured the risk was manageable. The psychology was revealing and disturbing. These weren't people who were inherently evil or incapable of following the law. They were people who made calculated decisions based on their assessment of likely consequences. In countries with stricter enforcement and harsher penalties, they became model citizens. In places where they perceived weakness or inconsistency in the justice system, they became predators. Rivera's thoughts often returned to a particular case from his earlier days as a detective in Minas Gerais, investigating drug trafficking at rave parties. He'd arrested a young man from a wealthy family, caught red-handed with a significant quantity of ecstasy and LSD. The boy's parents had arrived at the station in a BMW, desperate to help their son, but too honest to offer bribes. The mother had been inconsolable, crying at Rivera's desk while he prepared the arrest paperwork. In a moment of what he now considered misguided compassion, Rivera had tried to comfort her. "Look," he'd told her, "hire a good lawyer. This is Brazil. Nobody stays in jail long. Your son will probably be out tomorrow." It had been intended as reassurance, but Rivera immediately regretted the words. The mother had indeed thanked him the next day, driving by the station to honk her horn and wave, her son having been released at his custody hearing. But the interaction had left Rivera feeling deeply uncomfortable about the message he'd inadvertently sent, not just to the family, but to anyone else who might have witnessed the exchange. The case had crystallized something troubling about Brazil's justice system that Rivera had always felt but never articulated. The combination of weak enforcement, lenient sentences, and bureaucratic inefficiency created an environment where crime could flourish. Not because people were inherently criminal, but because the cost-benefit analysis often favored criminality over lawfulness. In Isaac Franklin's case, that systemic weakness had contributed to an unthinkable tragedy. Jennifer Walsh had calculated that she could steal a disabled child's benefits without consequences. When that calculation proved wrong, she had calculated that she could eliminate the evidence, Isaac himself, and avoid punishment. Even after being caught and convicted, she would serve only 22 years for taking a child's life, eligible for parole in less than 2 decades. The inadequacy of that sentence haunted Rivera. 22 years for torturing and murdering a 6-year-old boy seemed like a grotesque miscarriage of justice, a signal to other potential killers that even the most heinous crimes carried manageable consequences. But perhaps what disturbed Rivera most about the Isaac Franklin case wasn't the legal outcome. It was what the crime revealed about the capacity for evil in seemingly ordinary people. Jennifer Walsh hadn't been a hardened criminal or a career offender. She'd been a young mother and neighbor, someone who presented herself as trustworthy and caring. Her transformation into a child killer hadn't happened overnight. It had been a gradual process of moral compromise, small betrayals that had escalated into ultimate evil. "This case changed how I see people," Rivera admitted years later. "Before Isaac, I thought I could spot the dangerous ones. I thought evil had a face, a pattern, warning signs you could identify. But Jennifer Walsh looked like every other young mother in town. She had her own children. She seemed normal, even admirable." The realization that monsters could hide behind such ordinary facades had profound implications for Rivera's work and his worldview. If someone like Jennifer Walsh could commit such an atrocity, then anyone was capable of anything given the right circumstances and motivations. The comforting fiction that evil was easily identifiable, that good people were inherently different from bad people, had been shattered forever. Rivera found himself studying the case file obsessively in the months after the trial, searching for signs he might have missed, warning signals that could have predicted such an outcome. But the truth was that Jennifer Walsh had been a skilled manipulator, someone who understood how to present the right image while concealing her true nature. Her ability to maintain that facade while systematically stealing from a disabled child's family and then to murder that child in cold blood demonstrated a level of psychological sophistication that was deeply unsettling. The case had also revealed uncomfortable truths about the nature of revenge and how far people would go to inflict suffering on those who had wronged them. Jennifer Walsh hadn't killed Isaac Franklin in a moment of rage or desperation. She had killed him specifically because she knew it would destroy his mother. The murder had been calculated not just to eliminate a witness, but to cause maximum emotional damage to Rebecca Franklin. She wanted Rebecca to feel the kind of pain she thought she was feeling, Rivera reflected. But what Jennifer didn't understand or didn't care about was that her pain was self-inflicted. She had stolen money, gotten caught, and was facing the consequences of her own actions. Isaac was completely innocent, but in her mind he was just a tool she could use to hurt his mother. The psychological profile that emerged from the investigation painted Jennifer Walsh as someone with profound narcissistic tendencies, someone who saw other people primarily as objects to be manipulated for her own benefit. Isaac Franklin hadn't been a child to her. He'd been a resource to be exploited financially, and then a weapon to be used against his mother. This dehumanization of the victim was perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire case. Jennifer Walsh had been able to commit such an atrocity because she had never seen Isaac as a real person with his own rights, dreams, and inherent worth. To her, he was simply an extension of his mother, something that could be destroyed to cause Rebecca Franklin pain. Rivera often thought about Isaac in those final moments, a 6-year-old boy who had been excited about making cookies for his mother, who had trusted the woman who was supposed to care for him. The innocence of that trust, contrasted with the calculated evil of Jennifer's intentions, represented everything that was wrong with the world in microcosm. "I have a son," Rivera would say when discussing the case, "and after Isaac, I found myself looking at him differently, not with fear exactly, but with a new understanding of how precious and fragile innocence really is." Isaac trusted Jennifer Walsh completely. He went to her house thinking he was going to do something nice for his mother. Instead, he walked into a nightmare. The case had changed Rivera in fundamental ways, making him more suspicious of people's motivations, more aware of the potential for evil in seemingly ordinary situations. But it had also reinforced his commitment to his work as a police officer. In a world where people like Jennifer Walsh existed, where children like Isaac Franklin could be victimized by those they trusted most, law enforcement represented one of the few barriers between innocence and predation. "We can't save everyone," Rivera would tell his officers. "We can't prevent every crime or catch every criminal. But we can make sure that people like Jennifer Walsh understand that their actions have consequences. We can make sure that the next person who's thinking about hurting a child knows that someone is watching, someone is investigating, someone will hold them accountable." The Isaac Franklin case would remain open in Rivera's heart long after it was closed in the official files. It was a reminder of why his work mattered, why the pursuit of justice was worth the long hours and emotional toll. Because somewhere out there, other children were depending on people like Rivera to stand between them and the monsters who walked among us, wearing the faces of neighbors, babysitters, and trusted friends. And in that responsibility, Rivera found the only meaning he could extract from Isaac Franklin's senseless death, the determination to make sure it never happened again on his watch. 4 years after Isaac Franklin's murder, Detective Rivera found himself grappling with a truth that shattered whatever faith he'd managed to maintain in the justice system. Jennifer Walsh was free. Not fully free, but free enough to walk the streets, to breathe fresh air, to live a life that Isaac Franklin would never have the chance to experience. The news came to Rivera through official channels, but it hit him like a personal betrayal. Jennifer Walsh, convicted of torturing and murdering a 6-year-old child, had been released from prison in 2023 after serving just 4 years of her 22-year sentence. She now wore an electronic ankle monitor, a technological leash that was supposed to provide some measure of supervision and control. But Rivera knew the reality of electronic monitoring. It was a bureaucratic box-checking exercise, a way for the system to claim it was still watching, while essentially giving up the responsibility of actually punishing serious criminals. Jennifer Walsh could go to work, go shopping, visit friends, build relationships, pursue happiness, all while wearing a small device that would beep if she wandered too far from her designated areas. Isaac Franklin, meanwhile, remained in his grave, his body long since returned to dust, his dreams and potential forever extinguished by the woman who now enjoyed the privilege of supervised freedom. The philosophical implications of this outcome consumed Rivera's thoughts. As he reflected on his decades in law enforcement, he'd always believed that certain crimes warranted certain consequences, that justice required proportionality between the offense and the punishment. But Jennifer Walsh's early release forced him to confront the possibility that some crimes simply couldn't be adequately punished within the constraints of a civilized justice system. "There are some crimes," Rivera would later reflect, "where no matter how severe the punishment, it will never match the gravity of what was done. But that doesn't mean we should stop trying to find appropriate consequences. It means we need to be honest about what justice really looks like." Rivera found himself thinking about other high-profile cases, other killers who had manipulated the system's weaknesses to escape full accountability for their actions. The case of Susan Wright came to mind, a woman who had murdered her parents for inheritance money, whose calculated cruelty had shocked the nation. Like Jennifer Walsh, Wright had been young, female, and skilled at presenting herself as a victim rather than a perpetrator. "What bothers me most," Rivera said, "is how these killers learn from each other." Wright studied previous cases, figured out what mistakes earlier killers had made, and tried to be smarter about covering her tracks. Now, Jennifer Walsh's case will be studied by the next person who decides that murder is an acceptable solution to their problems. The pattern was disturbing and predictable. Each new killer built on the lessons of their predecessors, refining their methods, learning from the mistakes that had led to capture and conviction. It was a perverse form of evolution, driven by the human capacity for learning and adaptation applied to the darkest possible purposes. But Rivera's analysis went deeper than just the mechanics of how killers improved their techniques. He was grappling with fundamental questions about human nature and the role of punishment in society. Some crimes, he believed, were committed by people who were capable of being deterred by the threat of serious consequences. These were criminals who made calculated decisions based on risk assessment, who could be influenced by the certainty and severity of punishment. Other crimes, however, seemed to emerge from psychological dynamics that were largely immune to external deterrents. Family murders, crimes of passion, acts of revenge driven by deep emotional wounds. These often occurred regardless of what legal consequences might follow. Take domestic violence cases, Rivera explained. I've seen men who beat their wives to death, and even as they're being sentenced to life in prison, they're satisfied because they accomplished what they set out to do. In their twisted minds, they've won. She was theirs, and if they couldn't have her, nobody could. The punishment doesn't matter because they got what they really wanted. This psychological satisfaction that some killers derived from their crimes was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Rivera's work. It suggested that traditional concepts of deterrence were inadequate when dealing with individuals whose primary motivation wasn't avoiding consequences, but achieving a specific emotional outcome. Jennifer Walsh fell into this category. Her murder of Isaac Franklin hadn't been motivated by financial gain or self-preservation, though those factors had played a role. At its core, it had been an act of revenge designed to inflict maximum suffering on Rebecca Franklin. In that sense, Jennifer had succeeded completely. She had destroyed a mother's world, shattered a family, created wounds that would never fully heal. From Jennifer's perspective, the murder had been worth whatever consequences followed. She had experienced the satisfaction of ultimate revenge, of knowing that she had inflicted irreparable damage on someone who had dared to challenge her. The years in prison were simply the price of admission for that level of emotional gratification. This realization led Rivera to a disturbing conclusion about the nature of certain crimes and the limitations of the justice system. No punishment, however severe, could undo what Jennifer Walsh had done to Isaac Franklin and his family. No period of incarceration could restore a murdered child to life or heal a mother's broken heart. Justice, in its truest sense, was impossible. What the system could provide was a form of social protection, keeping dangerous individuals away from potential victims for as long as possible. But even that protection was temporary and imperfect, as Jennifer's early release demonstrated. Rivera found himself thinking about other crimes that seemed almost immune to traditional deterrence. Financial fraud was a perfect example. Modern swindlers operated with sophisticated knowledge of banking systems, international law, and jurisdictional limitations. They understood that even if caught, they were likely to serve relatively short sentences and emerge from prison with their expertise intact and their appetites for easy money undiminished. I've arrested embezzlers who stole millions, Rivera noted, and after serving 3 or 4 years, they're back in business. They see prison time as a cost of doing business, like paying taxes or licensing fees. It's not a deterrent, it's just part of the business model. The same logic applied to many other categories of crime: drug trafficking, identity theft, even violent robbery. Criminals in these areas often made careful calculations about risk versus reward, factoring in the likelihood of getting caught and the probable sentences they would face if convicted. You want to know the difference between American criminals and Brazilian criminals? Rivera asked rhetorically. I've interviewed dozens of people who committed crimes here in Brazil, but lived law-abiding lives when they were in the United States. When I ask them why, they always give the same answer. The consequences are too severe in America. They're not better people when they're in America. They're just better at math. This insight had profound implications for crime prevention and criminal justice policy. It suggested that many criminals were far more rational and calculating than the justice system assumed, and that deterrence could be effective if consequences were both certain and severe enough to outweigh the perceived benefits of criminal activity. But it also highlighted the tragic irony of Isaac Franklin's case. Jennifer Walsh and David Carter had committed their crime in a jurisdiction where the consequences were relatively mild, where early release was routine, where electronic monitoring was considered adequate supervision for convicted killers. They had made their calculations and determined that the risk was manageable. If they had lived in a place with stricter enforcement and harsher penalties, Isaac Franklin might still be alive today. The thought haunted Rivera because it suggested that the child's death had been in some sense preventable through better policy choices and stronger institutional responses to serious crime. The broader implications of this realization extended far beyond any single case. If criminal behavior was indeed responsive to the certainty and severity of consequences, then society had a responsibility to structure those consequences in ways that protected potential victims. Failing to do so was, in essence, a form of complicity in future crimes. Rivera's years of experience had taught him that the justice system's primary function wasn't punishment or rehabilitation. It was communication. Every arrest, every prosecution, every sentence sent a message to both criminals and potential criminals about what society considered acceptable behavior and what consequences would follow from crossing certain lines. When sentences were too lenient, when early release was routine, when monitoring was inadequate, the system was communicating that certain crimes weren't really that serious, that the consequences were manageable, that the risk might be worth taking. Every time we let someone like Jennifer Walsh walk free after 4 years, Rivera said, we're sending a message to every other potential child killer that the consequences aren't that bad. We're essentially advertising that murdering children is a low-risk crime with manageable consequences. The systemic nature of this problem was what frustrated Rivera most. Individual cases might be tragic, but they were also symptoms of larger institutional failures that enabled and encouraged criminal behavior through weak enforcement and inadequate consequences. These failures were particularly acute when it came to crimes against children. Society claimed to value the protection of innocence above almost everything else, but the actual mechanisms for ensuring that protection were woefully inadequate. Child killers like Jennifer Walsh served minimal sentences and returned to society with their capacity for violence intact and their understanding of systemic weaknesses enhanced. Rivera often wondered what message Isaac Franklin's case had sent to other potential offenders. Had Jennifer Walsh's early release encouraged others to view child murder as a crime with manageable consequences? Had her ability to manipulate the system's weaknesses provided a roadmap for future killers? The questions had no clear answers, but they pointed to the urgent need for fundamental reforms in how society responded to the most serious crimes. Rivera believed that crimes against children should carry mandatory life sentences without the possibility of parole, that electronic monitoring should be reserved for minor offenses, that the protection of future victims should take precedence over the rehabilitation of convicted killers. But he also understood the political and practical obstacles to such reforms. The same institutional weaknesses that had enabled Jennifer Walsh's early release also protected the careers of judges, prosecutors, and parole officials who preferred to avoid making hard decisions about dangerous criminals. As Rivera reflected on Isaac Franklin's case and its aftermath, he was struck by the cruel irony that the people most responsible for protecting children, law enforcement officers, prosecutors, judges, were often the ones least empowered to ensure that protection. They could arrest killers, prosecute them, and convict them, but they couldn't prevent the system from releasing those killers back into society to commit new crimes. In the end, Rivera was left with a profound sense of failure, not in his own work, but in the system he had served for so long. Isaac Franklin had been murdered by someone who should have been protecting him, and his killer had been released by a system that should have been protecting future victims. The badge Rivera wore, the oath he had taken, the decades he had spent pursuing justice, all of it felt inadequate in the face of such systemic failure. But it was also all he had, the only tools available for fighting back against the forces that had taken Isaac Franklin's life and would take other lives in the future. The boy's murder would remain forever unsolved in the truest sense, because justice had never really been achieved. Jennifer Walsh was free. David Carter had escaped accountability entirely, And somewhere out there, other children remained vulnerable to predators who had learned that the consequences for their actions were far less severe than society pretended them to be. But perhaps that was the most important lesson Isaac Franklin's case could teach, that justice was not something that happened automatically, that protection was not something that could be taken for granted, and that the price of safety was eternal vigilance against those who would exploit any weakness in the systems designed to keep evil at bay. In Isaac Franklin's memory, Rivera would continue that vigilance, knowing that every case mattered, every investigation counted, and every arrest sent a message that someone was still watching, still fighting, still refusing to let the monsters win without a battle. Because in the end, that was all that stood between innocence and evil. Dedicated people doing their jobs, fighting the good fight, and refusing to give up even when the system failed them. Even when justice remained elusive, even when the monsters walked free, Isaac Franklin deserved better. They all did. And Detective Rivera would spend the rest of his career trying to make sure that the next child in danger had a better chance than Isaac had been given in those final terrible moments when trust was betrayed and innocence was destroyed by people who should have been protecting both.